Hi, I'm Panchali, and today we're going to talk about the psychological aspect of sexuality education. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nibendra Uduman. I'm a counseling psychologist, and I'm currently attached to Samuddana, which is the King's College London Resource Centre for Mental Health in Colombo. And I also practice privately as a psychologist.
So in Sri Lanka, we all have different personal opinions about sexuality education. In your professional opinion, what do you think about sexuality education?
Okay, so sexuality education, most people look at it as just education about sex per se, but that is not what sexuality education is about. So like Dakshita before me was talking about comprehensive sexuality and reproductive health education. It should include not only about how to engage in sex protectively or how to use protection, all those things, but it should also talk about, from a psychological point of view, it should talk about relationships, how to manage relationships, how to manage feelings, how to cope when you face things like rejection. So it's not just only about the mechanical aspect of sex, but it's also includes so many other things. So that's my personal opinion, and I think it's a very, very crucial time in Sri Lanka for us to implement sexuality education in the school system.
And in Sri Lanka, we find that there is a huge taboo about learning about sex, talking about sex. And what is, in your opinion, the best way to get over this taboo?
So when you talk about sex, you need to also look at our culture, and you need to look at the traditions, you need to look at religion, you need to look at the different practices that are there in Sri Lanka. So if you look at our country, or for that matter India, a couple of centuries back, sex was a very spoken about thing. It was a very natural thing, and people very openly expressed their views about sex and spoke about sex. There were paintings depicting sexual acts, and homosexuality was a very natural thing. So, and as the ages went by, there was a lot of, from where I see it, there's a lot of misinterpretation of what culture is all about, or what cultural norms are all about, or what religion really says. Because some religions say, okay, for example, homosexuality is a sin, or sex is dirty, sex is a sin, sex is vulgar, whatever it is. But actually, it's just how we have interpreted these religious or spirit kind of cultural norms, which might not actually be true in the real sense of how they were originated.
Right. What's the best way as a country for us to step out of this social stigma, for us to get away from this taboo around sex? Because obviously it's hindering many people learning about safe sex. What's the best way to get out of it?
Okay, so it's not only sex, there are so many other things which are taboo in our country. But for example, I think a starting point would be open dialogue in society. So whereas we don't have in Sri Lanka public forums where you can very freely talk about things like sex, or for example mental health for that matter. There's no proper space which is safe to talk about these things. So I think starting that sense of dialogue in this country between youth, between peers, between parents and children, between teachers and students, I think that could be a really good starting point for us to break that stigma and taboo attached to sex per se. And also the proper flow of information when it comes to sex, because I think, as both Sarah and Dakshita spoke before me, that there's a lot of flow of accurate information which youth have they have access to very freely. So if we were to curb that and try to make an alternative to that by implementing sexuality education in the school system, then we would prevent such a taboo or a stigma from existing, because then there would be more free communication between people.
How would you, obviously as you said before, sexuality education is not just about sex, it's about hormones, it's about growing up, and it's about your reproductive organs. And when in all of that, we're going to learn about new feelings, and we're going to have to deal with things like homosexuality. And how would you encourage children, or how do you encourage young adults to tackle this emotional ride when they are discovering or learning about their sexuality?
Well, I think that should start from a very small age, because we talk about age-appropriate and culture-appropriate sexuality education, but maybe even from kindergarten, there's no harm in starting talking about these things in a age-appropriate manner. But what happens is we wait till O levels or year 9 or 10 to really start looking at the biology book, which shows your reproductive system, and what happens, the penis enters a vagina and you have a semen enters the woman and you have a baby. But beyond that you don't really learn anything about contraceptives, about protection, about how to stay safe from violence, abuse, feelings. None of that is covered in biology or in school for that matter. So that is what's really important, for children to be taught just not the biological aspect of it, but also how to work with feelings, how to cope with pain, how to cope with rejection, failure, because these things are what really affects the young population in this generation. Because I myself am not from a very far generation myself. I was just in school 10 years ago. So therefore for me also it's a very present and very real situation which is happening now in Sri Lanka, where young people don't have a voice to come out and talk about these things. Take homosexuality, take a transgender, what kind of difficulties that they have to go through, because it's illegal, it's a stigma, there's a taboo, and people are just think it's unnatural, it's dirty, it's just crazy, they should all be put in a mental hospital and locked up, but that is not what it is about. So that should start, this education, if it starts from kindergarten, talking about managing diversity, managing someone different than you, how to accept someone, not judgmentally, So those kind of things I think is really valuable in trying to promote children to think maybe in a more accepting manner about people who are different than them, or to kind of break out of that stereotypical way of looking at things.
We talked about how it's necessary for teachers and parents to teach children about sex and sexuality. So at which age do you think it's appropriate to have sex law?
So it's difficult to directly say that teachers or parents should talk about these things very openly to children, because that's not been the practice for a long time, and it's not easy to kind of change things overnight. So what I would say is, of course, communication is really important within a family, and parents should have the ability to talk freely to their children about these things, and children to talk to their parents too. But if that is not the case, because you can't expect everybody to be as open and free as you'd want them to be, but you can use other methods. For example, I'll be very honest, my father gave me a book which described everything you needed to know about sex, and that's how I figured out that a baby is made in such a way, right? So like that, books can be used, which is age appropriate, of course, and also things like theater, arts, creativity. You can use sports, you can use so many different things to get the message through to children. So it's just necessary, it doesn't have to be only talking coming from an adult to a child, but it can be from more of a peer-based learning, or it can be just the child being exposed to, even in the media, even in TV, there can be programs where it's child-friendly, and the child is able to grasp what they're being taught about sexuality education.
Okay, so even though it's not practiced much in Sri Lanka, at some point in anyone's life, you're going to get the sex talk. Yeah. So in your opinion, what is the most appropriate age for parents to, or anyone to tell a child or give the sex talk?
Okay. So this whole notion of sex talk in itself kind of makes things a little difficult, because then it becomes this thing you have to do. But that shouldn't be the case ideally, because it should be more of a natural thing, because ideally we are all sexual beings, right? If we are human, we are sexual beings. So this whole having the sex talk or learning about the birds and the bees, it mystifies sex. It makes sex something that is hard to grasp, but actually the whole other notion of looking at it should be that you should demystify sex and make sex a part of daily life, because it is a part of daily life. Everything about sex or sexuality is a part of our daily life. So if you demystify it and make it look more comfortable to deal with, rather than having this sex talk where it's very awkward with your child and son, you should do this and you shouldn't do that, but actually have it in a different way, which is more easy for the child to grasp. So, and talking about the age, there is I can't pinpoint an age and say it's the correct age to talk about sex, but the earlier it's done, in my opinion, it's better.
Alright, so let's talk about gender differences, about how people are taught about sexuality education. I mean, women are taught differently, men are taught differently, and both genders have different approaches to sexuality. So, if you can elaborate on that?
Okay. So again, when you talk to people, just the masses in Sri Lanka, you find that there's this notion that a girl doesn't need to know too much about anything, because even though we are less of a patriarchal society compared to some other neighboring countries, we still have that attitude that the girl is slightly less equal than the man, which ideally shouldn't be the situation. But because of that, there's this notion that the girl shouldn't, because anyway she'll get what she needs to get as time goes by. And for boys, it's like the boys will learn no matter whether you teach them or not. They'll learn what they have to know. But the fact is that sometimes they might learn what is not correct or what is not accurate, and that would lead to problems when it comes to diseases, when it comes to unwanted pregnancies, when it comes to a lot of other social problems that we have in Sri Lanka. So that is the whole gender thing, because there's this notion that why bother teaching a girl? And if you look at condoms, if you look at contraceptives that people advertise, if you look at the newspapers, do you see condoms for women ever advertised? No. It's always, for example, they advertise condoms, they advertise condoms, they advertise, but do you ever see contraception for women being advertised? No. So that's where we need to change the way we look at the gender balance when it comes to sexuality and reproductive health education.
All right. Thank you.